I spent 3 years of my life saving $10,000. 3 years of wearing the same frayed coat every winter. 3 years of skipping vacations, saying no to dinners, saying no to weekend trips, saying no to anything that felt like living. 3 years of working overtime as an accountant, late nights, early mornings, sitting under fluorescent lights long after everyone else had gone home to their families. I did all of that for one reason. I wanted to give my sister the most beautiful wedding gift she had ever received in her life. I wanted to walk into that wedding with my head held high and finally prove, after 32 long years, that I was worthy of being called a Palmer. But when I arrived at my sister Miranda's $200,000 wedding in Greenwich, Connecticut, I was not greeted with a hug. I was not greeted with a smile. I was not welcomed the way a sister welcomes a sister she has not seen in months. Instead, a woman in a black uniform handed me a small gray laminated badge. The kind of badge you see at corporate events. The kind of badge that tells you without a single word exactly where you stand. It read limited access guest. I stood there holding that badge, trying to understand what it meant. And then my mother appeared beside me. She leaned in close, the way she always does when she wants to say something she does not want anyone else to hear. And she whispered the most painful words I have ever heard in my entire life. She said, "That means no plate for you, Waverly. There is no room for you at the reception. No room." At my own sister's wedding. They wanted my $10,000. They wanted my gift, my sacrifice, my 3 years of saying no to myself so I could say yes to them. But they did not want me at the table. So I did the only thing I could do. I walked across that beautiful lawn, past the white floral arrangements and the string quartet, and all the guests in their designer clothes, and I walked straight to the gift table. I picked up my envelope, the one with my name written on it in my own handwriting, and I tucked it back into my clutch. And then my mother grabbed my arm. And in that moment, with her hand gripping my arm and her eyes full of panic, I looked at her and I said 5 words that made her face go completely white. But before I tell you what those 5 words were, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand how a mother can look at her own daughter and decide she is not worth a seat at the table. Because this story did not start at that wedding. This story started a very long time ago. My name is Waverly Palmer. And in my family, I was never the important one. My sister Miranda was the golden child. She always had been. From the time we were little girls, it was clear that Miranda was the one my parents had built their dreams on. Miranda was sharp, driven, and beautiful in the way that makes people stop and stare. She went to Harvard. She got her MBA. She became an investment banker in New York City, the kind of career my parents could drop into any conversation and watch people's eyes light up with admiration. I went to community college. Not because I was not smart. Not because I did not try. I went to community college because when I asked my parents for help with tuition, they told me they simply could not afford it. They said money was tight. They said I would have to figure it out on my own. And then 2 years later, they bought Miranda an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I never said a word about it. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I would build my own life my own way, and that someday it would all make sense. I became an accountant. I got a small apartment in Queens. I paid every single one of my own bills without asking anyone for a single dollar. But the slights kept coming. Small ones and large ones year after year. There is a family portrait hanging on the mantel in my parents' living room. A beautiful wooden frame with gold edges and a professional photo inside. My parents smiling. Miranda smiling. And a blank space where I should have been standing. They told me the frame was too small. They never bought a bigger one. When I graduated from college, I dressed up, I walked across that stage, and I looked out into the audience searching for my parents' faces. They were not there. I found out later they had been 300 miles away, taking Miranda on a tour of a university she was considering for graduate school. They forgot I was graduating. Or maybe they did not forget. Maybe they simply decided it was not important enough to show up. I spent years absorbing these moments and telling myself that family is complicated. I stayed quiet. I kept showing up. I kept trying. And when Miranda got engaged to Jonathan Whitmore III, a man from one of the oldest, wealthiest families in Greenwich, I felt something shift inside me. I thought maybe this is my chance. Maybe this wedding is the moment I finally show them who I am. Maybe if I give something truly extraordinary, they will finally see me. So I saved. For 3 years I saved every extra dollar I had. And I showed up to that wedding ready to be a sister, ready to be a daughter, ready to finally belong. What happened next changed everything. To understand why my own mother would ban me from a meal at my sister's wedding, you have to understand the way the Palmer family worked. You have to understand the unspoken rules, the quiet hierarchy, the invisible ranking system that nobody ever said out loud but everybody followed. In the Palmer family, there were 2 kinds of children. There was Miranda, and then there was everyone else. And for most of my life, I was the everyone else. My mother, Patricia Palmer, was a woman who cared deeply about one thing above everything else: how things looked, not how things were. Not whether her children were happy or healthy or loved, but how the family appeared to the outside world. What other people thought when they looked at us. What kind of image we projected at church, at dinner parties, at school events. Image was everything to my mother. And from a very early age, I understood that I did not fit the image she had in her mind. Miranda fit it perfectly. Miranda was tall, polished, and effortlessly confident. She walked into rooms and people noticed. She spoke and people listened. She had the kind of presence that my mother had always wanted for herself but never quite managed to achieve. So she poured everything into Miranda. Every ounce of energy, every dollar of investment, every drop of pride. Miranda was her masterpiece. And I was the rough sketch she had moved past. I do not say this to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because it is the truth, and because the truth is the only thing that makes the rest of this story make sense. Growing up, I watched my mother plan Miranda's future the way an architect plans a building. Carefully, deliberately, with a very clear picture of what the finished product should look like. Miranda would go to the best schools. Miranda would marry the right kind of man. Miranda would live in the right kind of neighborhood and move in the right kind of circles. And my mother would stand at Miranda's side, finally belonging to the world she had always wanted to belong to. I was not part of that plan. I was a complication. A side note. Something to be managed quietly so it did not get in the way of the main event. And for a long time I accepted that role without even realizing I was accepting it. I made myself small. I asked for less. I celebrated Miranda's wins louder than anyone and kept my own quietly to myself. I became very good at disappearing. But then Miranda met Jonathan Whitmore III. And everything my mother had been building toward her entire life suddenly felt within reach. The Whitmore family was everything Patricia Palmer had ever dreamed of. Old money, Greenwich estates, charity galas, summer homes, the kind of last name that opens doors before you even knock. When Miranda called home to say Jonathan had proposed, I genuinely think it was the happiest day of my mother's life. Happier than her own wedding. Happier than the day Miranda graduated from Harvard. This was the arrival she had been waiting for. The wedding planning began immediately, and it was enormous. $200,000. A Greenwich estate with manicured gardens and a reception tent with crystal chandeliers. A guest list carefully curated to include only the people who would reflect well on the family. And that is where things started to shift in a way I did not see coming. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me. She was warm on the phone, warmer than usual, and I remember thinking that something felt slightly off about her tone. She told me how excited she was. She told me how beautiful the venue was. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that it would be such a lovely gesture if I could send my gift money early. She said it would help with some last-minute expenses. She said she would make sure Miranda knew it came from me. Something told me not to do it. I do not know exactly what it was. Maybe years of learning to read the small signals my mother sent, but I told her I would bring the gift with me on the day. She pushed a little and I held firm, and the conversation ended pleasantly enough. I did not think much more about it. What I did not know was that by the time that phone call happened, my name had already been crossed off the seating chart. Not moved to a different table. Not placed in a less prominent seat. Crossed off entirely. And in her place, my mother had written a small note in her own cursive handwriting that a friend of mine, A woman who worked for the wedding planner, photographed and sent to me 4 days before the wedding. The note said, "Guest will receive limited access badge. No meal." I sat with my phone in my hand and read those words 3 times. Guest. Not daughter. Not sister. Guest. Limited access. No meal. I want you to understand what it feels like to read something like that. It is not like being punched. It is quieter than that. It is more like the floor dropping out from under you slowly, so slowly that for a moment you are not even sure it is happening. And then you are just standing in empty air, wondering how long you have been falling without knowing it. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about calling Miranda. I thought about sending a message demanding an explanation, giving them the chance to tell me it was a mistake. But I had spent 32 years giving people the chance to tell me things were mistakes. I had spent 32 years waiting for the explanation that never came. So this time I did something different. I got dressed in the most beautiful outfit I owned. I did my hair. I put on my lipstick. And I drove to Greenwich. Because I had not spent 3 years saving $10,000 to be erased from a phone call. I had spent 3 years saving $10,000 to look my family in the eye. And that is exactly what I intended to do. I arrived at the estate early. I had planned it that way. I wanted to see the place before the crowds filled in, before the noise and the movement and the carefully managed chaos of a $200,000 wedding made it impossible to think clearly. I drove through the iron gates and down a long gravel driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, and I remember thinking that my mother must have felt like she had finally made it when she first saw this place. Like all those years of planning and pushing and sacrificing had led her exactly here, to this long driveway, to these iron gates, to this world she had always wanted to be part of. The estate was breathtaking. There is no other word for it. Rolling green lawns that stretched further than I could see. Flower arrangements so large and elaborate, they looked like something from a magazine. White chairs lined up in perfect rows facing a stone altar covered in climbing roses. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved quietly across the grounds carrying trays and adjusting details. A string quartet was warming up near the entrance to the garden. Everything was polished and perfect and carefully considered. And standing in the middle of all of it, in my nicest dress with my envelope in my clutch, I felt exactly like what my mother had decided I was. Out of place. The woman in the black uniform found me almost immediately. She was efficient and professional and completely emotionless as she handed me the gray laminated badge. She did not apologize. She did not look uncomfortable. She simply handed it to me the way you hand someone a parking ticket, like it was just a thing that had to be done. I took it and looked down at it and felt the full weight of what my mother had arranged. This was not an accident. This was not an oversight. This had been planned, organized, and executed with the same attention to detail that had gone into every other part of this wedding. My humiliation had been scheduled. I clipped the badge to my dress because I did not know what else to do in that moment. And then my mother appeared. She was dressed beautifully, her hair perfect, her smile wide and practiced, working the arriving guests like she had been doing this her whole life. She saw me from across the lawn and her smile did not disappear exactly. It just tightened. She made her way over and leaned in close and said what she said. And then she was gone again, back to her guests, back to her performance, leaving me standing alone with a gray badge on my chest and no seat at my own sister's wedding. I found my way to the ceremony on my own. The seating was divided into 2 clear sections, the important guests on wide, cushioned chairs with elegant programs placed on each seat, and a row of plain folding chairs at the very back for everyone else. I sat in the back row. I watched the ceremony from a distance, craning slightly to see past the heads of the people in front of me. I watched Miranda walk down the aisle in a gown that must have cost more than my monthly rent. I watched my father, beaming and proud, walking beside her. I watched my mother in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, performing the emotion of a mother giving away her daughter, and doing it beautifully. At one point, a photographer moved through the guests taking candid shots of the family. I watched my parents gather close, my mother pulling people in, arranging the shot the way she always arranged everything. I was standing maybe 5 feet away. The photographer looked in my direction for just a moment. And my mother turned slightly, repositioning the group, angling everyone just enough so that I was outside the frame. It was so smooth, so practiced, that if you had not been watching for it, you would never have noticed it at all. But I noticed. I had been noticing it my whole life. The ceremony was beautiful in spite of everything. Miranda and Jonathan exchanged vows that were personal and warm and made several people around me cry. I sat in my folding chair at the back and felt something strange. Not quite sadness, not quite anger. Something more like clarity. Like a fog I had been living inside for years was finally starting to lift, and I could see the shape of things as they actually were rather than how I had always hoped they might be. When the ceremony ended, the guests began moving toward the reception tent. I could see it from where I stood, glowing warmly from inside, the chandeliers catching the late afternoon light, the sound of a live band already starting up. People moved toward it easily, naturally, the way you move toward something you are certain you belong in. I followed at a distance, watching the flow of guests, holding my gray badge in my hand because I had unclipped it during the ceremony and could not bring myself to put it back on. And then I reached the entrance to the tent and a security guard stepped in front of me. He was polite about it. He was not unkind, but he was firm. "Gold badges only," he said. He gestured toward the badge in my hand and shook his head gently. I looked past him into the tent, at the long tables dressed in white linen, at the plates and the crystal glasses and the candles, at my family already finding their seats inside. And then I saw Miranda. She was maybe 20 feet away, just inside the entrance to the tent, talking to someone I did not recognize. She looked radiant in that way that brides always do, like joy itself had settled over her like a second skin. And then she turned and for just a moment our eyes met. One full second of eye contact. She saw me standing outside the tent with a security guard between us and a gray badge in my hand. She saw me clearly. And then she turned back to her conversation and kept talking, and the moment was gone as if it had never happened at all. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. Not the quiet of defeat. A different kind of quiet. The kind that comes when you have finally run out of reasons to keep making excuses for people. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone to do the right thing and accept fully and completely that they are simply not going to. I had driven to Greenwich in my best dress with $10,000 in my clutch, hoping, somewhere deep and stubborn inside me, that I had misread the situation, that there had been some mistake, that my family would see me standing there and feel something, shame, love, regret, anything, and make it right. Miranda had looked directly at me and kept walking. I turned around and walked back across the lawn toward the gift table. The gift table was set up near the entrance of the estate, just inside the main gates, draped in white fabric and covered with beautifully wrapped boxes and cards in every size. Someone had arranged fresh flowers along the edges of it, small white roses that matched the ones on the altar. Everything at this wedding was considered. Everything was deliberate. Even the table where people left their money had been made to look like something out of a dream. I walked to it slowly. I was not rushing. I was not panicking. I felt in that moment more calm than I had felt in years. It was the kind of calm that comes not from peace but from decision. From finally knowing exactly what you are going to do after a very long time of not knowing. I found my envelope easily. It was a thick cream-colored one with my name written on the front in my own handwriting. The kind of envelope that looks substantial because what is inside it is substantial. I picked it up and held it for a moment. $10,000. 3 years. And then I opened my clutch and slid it inside. I was still standing at that table when I heard my mother's voice behind me. She had seen me from across the lawn. I do not know exactly how long she had been watching, but she had covered the distance between us quickly for a woman in heels on grass, which told me she understood immediately what I was doing. She came up close behind me and she grabbed my arm, the same way she had grabbed it when I first arrived, and she hissed at me in that low, controlled voice she uses when she is furious but cannot afford to make a scene. She told me I was being ridiculous. She told me I was ruining everything. She told me that this was Miranda's day and that whatever issues I had could be dealt with later, after the wedding, like an adult. I want to be honest with you about something. In that moment, part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to make myself small, to apologize, to smooth things over and keep the peace, that part of me almost listened. Almost. Because that voice, my mother's voice, had a kind of power over me that I had spent my entire life struggling against. It was not the words she used. It was the tone. The tone that told me I was being difficult. The tone that told me I was the problem. The tone that had convinced me for 32 years that the reasonable thing to do was to accept whatever I was given and be grateful for it. But something had shifted in me at the entrance to that tent. When Miranda had looked at me and turned away, something had settled into place inside me like a key turning in a lock. And I found, standing at that gift table with my mother's hand on my arm, that the voice did not have the same power anymore. I looked at her, and I did not whisper back. I did not argue. I did not explain myself or justify myself or ask for anything. I simply held up the gray laminated badge so she could see it clearly, and I said 5 words. I said, "I am taking it back." That was it. 5 words. No drama, no speech, no tears. Just 5 words spoken in a normal, clear, steady voice in the open air of a Greenwich estate on a Saturday afternoon. And those 5 words in that moment at that volume were enough. Because we were not alone. Standing less than 4 feet away from us, partially obscured by the edge of the gift table, was Eleanor Whitmore, Jonathan's mother. The woman my mother had spent the last 18 months trying to impress, trying to charm, trying to convince that the Palmers were exactly the kind of family the Whitmores should want to be connected to. Eleanor Whitmore, who was tall and silver-haired and had the kind of quiet authority that comes from never needing to raise your voice because everyone already listens when you speak. She had been signing a card at the edge of the table, and she had heard everything. My mother saw her at almost exactly the same moment I did. I watched the color leave my mother's face in a way I had never seen before. Not a blush, not a flush. An actual draining, like something essential had been pulled out of her all at once. She released my arm. Eleanor looked at my mother for a moment without saying anything, and then she looked at me. She looked at the gray badge I was still holding up. She looked at my clutch where my envelope had disappeared. And she put down her pen very deliberately, the way people do when they want you to understand that what they are about to say has their full attention behind it. She asked me, calmly and directly, if I was the sister. I told her yes. I told her my name was Waverly. I told her I had driven from Queens that morning to celebrate my sister's wedding. And then, because she was still looking at me with those calm, clear eyes and I felt somehow that she genuinely wanted to understand, I told her the rest. Not in a rush, not with tears, not with the kind of trembling anger that would have made me look unstable. I just told her simply and clearly that I had spent 3 years saving $10,000 to give my sister a gift that would change her life. And that I had arrived at this wedding to find that my own family had decided I was not valuable enough to be given a seat or a meal inside that tent. I held up the badge one more time, and then I put it down on the gift table like it was something I was returning. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever stood inside. There were other people nearby, guests who had drifted toward the gift table, a couple of staff members, a man I recognized as one of Jonathan's uncles. All of them were very still. My mother was very still. Even the air felt still. And then Eleanor Whitmore looked at my mother with an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It was not angry exactly. It was colder than anger. It was the look of a woman who has just learned something about someone that she cannot unfind. And she said, in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly clear, that the Whitmores value family. All of family. Not just the ones who photograph well. She said it to my mother. She did not look away when she said it. And then she turned to me, and in a completely different tone, warm and unhurried, she told me that there would absolutely be a place for me inside that tent if I wanted it. My mother opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at me. And for the first time in my memory, Patricia Palmer had absolutely nothing to say. I picked up my clutch. I looked at Eleanor and thanked her sincerely, because she had done something in that moment that my own family had never managed to do. She had seen me. But I told her I would not be staying. Not because I was making a point, Not to punish anyone, but because some things, once you have seen them clearly, cannot be unseen. And I had seen my family clearly enough. I turned and walked toward the gates. I walked through those iron gates and down the long gravel driveway, and I did not look back. Not once. I had spent 32 years looking back, waiting for someone to call after me, waiting for someone to say, "Wait, we were wrong, come back, you matter." And maybe some part of me was still waiting even then, still listening for footsteps on the gravel behind me. But I kept walking. Past the perfectly trimmed hedges, past the long line of cars belonging to people who had gold badges and reserved seats and full plates waiting for them inside that glowing tent. I kept walking until I reached my car, and I got in. And I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, and the envelope in my clutch and the gray badge sitting on the passenger seat beside me. And then I drove home. I want to tell you what that drive felt like because I think it matters. It was not triumphant. It was not the feeling you get at the end of a movie when the music swells and everything resolves, and the person who was wronged rides off into a golden sunset. It was quieter than that. It was more complicated than that. There was grief in that car with me. Real grief. The kind that comes not from losing something suddenly but from finally admitting to yourself that you lost it a long time ago and have just been pretending otherwise. I grieved the mother I had always wanted. I grieved the sister relationship I had spent my whole life hoping might still become something real. I grieved the version of that wedding I had imagined in my head during 3 years of saving and sacrificing. The one where I walked in and gave my gift and my mother hugged me and Miranda said she did not know what she would do without me. I grieved all of it on that drive home. And then somewhere on the highway, with the city coming back into view ahead of me, the grief started to change shape. It did not disappear. Grief does not disappear. But it began to feel less like something crushing me, and more like something I was carrying. And things you carry you can put down when you are ready. You can choose where to set them. You are in charge of the weight. By the time I pulled into Queens, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. Not the version of myself that existed in relation to my family, not the difficult one, not the invisible one, not the one who did not fit the frame. Just myself. Waverly. The woman who had worked overtime for 3 years and saved $10,000 and driven to Greenwich in her best dress because she believed, stubbornly and completely, that she deserved to be seen. That woman. I felt like her. My phone started ringing before I had even taken off my shoes. My father first. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother twice, 3 times. Then a number I did not recognize that turned out to be Miranda calling from someone else's phone, because I had already stopped answering hers. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window and watched the street outside my apartment, which did not have a park view then, just a brick wall and a fire escape and a narrow slice of sky. But it was mine. Every inch of it was mine. And that night it felt like enough. The messages came later. My mother's voicemails were not apologies. They were explanations. Long, careful explanations about logistics and seating capacities and the Whitmore family's expectations, and how none of it was personal. It was just the reality of a formal event with limited space. She said the word personal 4 times while explaining something that was entirely personal. I did not respond. My father left one short message. He said he was sorry. He did not say what he was sorry for specifically, which told me he had not yet decided how sorry he actually was. Miranda sent a text that said, "Please call me, we need to fix this," and I noticed the word fix, not apologize, not explain, not make right. Fix. As in, the problem was not what they had done but the damage it had caused to something they cared about. Which was not me. Which was the Whitmores. I found out through someone in the family that Eleanor Whitmore had been noticeably cool toward my mother for the remainder of the reception. That she had mentioned to Jonathan, quietly but not quietly enough, that she hoped the way the Palmers treated their own family was not a reflection of the values they would bring into her son's marriage. I found out that Miranda had spent part of her own wedding reception trying to manage her new mother-in-law's opinion of her family, instead of simply enjoying the day she had planned for months. I found out that my mother had not slept well that night, or the several nights after. I did not feel satisfied by any of this. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story where the person who was wronged gets to feel victorious when the people who wronged them face consequences. But that is not how it actually feels. What I felt was tired and sad and ready to stop spending my energy on people who had never spent theirs on me. My father called again 2 weeks later. This time his message was different. He said he had been thinking. He said he had spent a long time telling himself that keeping the peace in the family meant staying out of the middle, not taking sides, letting things be. And he said he understood now that staying out of the middle when your child is being hurt is not keeping the peace. It is choosing a side. He just had not been honest with himself about which side he was choosing. He said he was sorry. He said he was sorry for a long time, for the graduation, for the portrait, for the tuition, for all of it. He asked if we could talk. I called him back. It was a long conversation and not an easy one, but it was real. It was the most honest conversation my father and I had ever had. And it was a beginning, small and fragile but genuine, of something neither of us had managed to build before. My mother has not apologized. I do not say that with anger anymore. I say it as a fact, the way you state the weather. She has reached out, in her way, carefully worded messages that hover just at the edge of accountability without ever quite landing there. Invitations to family events that I have mostly declined. Occasional attempts to reframe what happened as a misunderstanding that everyone has blown out of proportion. I understand her better now than I ever did before. I understand that she is a woman who built her entire sense of worth on the image she could project to the world, and that apologizing to me would require her to admit that image was built on something cruel. That is a very hard thing to admit. I am not sure she will ever get there, and I have made my peace with that. Miranda and I have spoken twice since the wedding. Both conversations were short and surface level, and left me feeling the way you feel after eating something that looked much better than it tasted. I do not hate my sister. I feel something more like sorrow for her, for the person she became inside a family that taught her the wrong things about what makes someone valuable. Maybe someday that changes. Maybe it does not. I cannot make that happen. I can only be responsible for myself. I still have my $10,000. I put it toward a new apartment, one with a view of a park, green and quiet, the kind of view that makes mornings feel like they are worth getting up for. I got a promotion at work, the kind I have been working toward for years, and I accepted it without calling anyone in my family to share the news. I shared it with my friends who celebrated it the way good people celebrate each other. Fully, genuinely, without calculation. I am learning slowly what it feels like to be around people who do not make you earn your seat at the table. People who simply pull out a chair and say, "You belong here," without you ever having to prove it. That is the thing I want to leave you with, if I leave you with anything at all. You are never obligated to keep funding a relationship that costs you everything and gives you nothing back. You are never obligated to show up for people who have made it clear, over and over again, in 100 small ways and a few very large ones, that your presence is conditional on your usefulness. Understanding why someone hurts you does not mean you have to keep standing in front of them. You can understand someone completely and still choose to walk away. Those two things can both be true at the same time. I walked through those iron gates and down that gravel driveway and I did not look back. And every single day since then I have been glad that I kept walking.